Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today we're going to take a look at the Update 35 Warden Revamp in The Lord of the Rings Online. Today, the focus will be on the new Gambits and the changed effects for all of our current Gambits, as we have in the first round of beta here. First off, let's go ahead and look at the new Gambits, and we'll start off with the Recklessness Gambits. The first one you might notice is new is Cauterizing Steel. So this is going to be a new Gambit in the Spear, Shield, or 1-2 Gambit line. Now, just to point out, the game seems to have adopted the terminology Gambit sequence, and that just refers to the same thing as what I call and have called a Gambit line the past few years, so I will try to be changing to Gambit sequence. Anyway, that note aside, what Cauterizing Steel does is it does a lot of upfront damage to a single target. You see it's in 3 attacks here, but it does have a special effect at the end of this Gambit sequence, which is to consume your power attack, mighty blow, and unerring strike, or your single target bleed gambits. It will consume the damage over time effect to deal bonus damage. And now is a good time to point out, because these changes are in beta, I won't focus too much on numbers because of course a lot of balancing probably still has to happen. I know there are some issues with damage, so we won't be focusing too much on that for this video. But back to Cauterizing Steel, the main use of this gambit is going to be for single target burst damage, especially at the end of a fight. So if you have all these bleeds on your enemy, you can get a lot of burst damage to finish off the fight. So Cauterizing Steel will be a nice tool for Wardens moving forward. But as we go down the list, we'll notice another new gambit called Spear of Fate, but I'm actually going to wait on that one because Unseen Strike is another new gambit, and it's very similar to Cauterizing Steel, but AoE. So this is going to be in the Spear Fist gambit line, or the 1-3 gambit sequence, and this gambit line will do AoE damage now, and Unseen Strike as the last gambit in the sequence will consume your AoE light dots on the enemy. So that's going to be from the 3-2 gambit sequence. So Warcry, Brink of Victory, Surety of Death, and Desolation damage over time effects will be consumed, and this will deal bonus damage for those. This really helps with AoE burst damage against enemies. I also should point out that for each individual effect, so Warcry, Brink of Victory, etc., each of those individually will have bonus damage for Unseen Strike, so you can get a burst AoE damage with this. The next gambit we have is going to be Spear of Fate, which is the last new damaging gambit. So this is going to be in the Fist Spear or 3-1 gambit line, and it just does damage over time, but it pulses very rapidly. So we're familiar with the 3-1 gambit sequence already dealing light damage over time, but this particular gambit will deal the light damage over time at a much faster pace. And you see in the middle of that sentence, I decided to put these up here for comparison, but the 4-length gambit Spear of Virtue, you can see the damage numbers. It ticks every 3 seconds for 18 seconds, but Spear of Fate, which is going to be 3-1-3-1-3, that will tick every 1 second for 10 seconds. So even though the individual ticks on Spear of Fate are weaker than Spear of Virtue, overall it will do more damage because not only does it tick faster, but also has more total ticks. And these are all of the new Recklessness Gambits, or the ones that start with a Spear builder. Next up, we'll look at the Determination Gambits, where we have the most new Gambits, starting here with Deflection, which is going to be 3-2-1. This Gambit does do some AoE damage, but the big effect from it is it actually reduces your threat against enemies. This can be valuable to reduce your threat as a DPS warden, but it also has some interesting uses as a tanking warden as a threat dump, a tool that the warden did not have before. Deflection is the only new gambit that starts with a fist builder. So the rest of ours are going to start with a shield builder, and the first one here is Readied Blade. So this one is just a defensive buff. It's going to be Shield, Fist, Spear, and this one decreases incoming melee damage and also gives you a decent chunk of parry rating. It has a fairly long 1-minute duration, so you will not have to refresh it very frequently, but it's something that's going to be valuable to keep up as a tank warden and a new defensive tool that we will have to mitigate damage. And in case you did not know, with this update, you will have access to all of the gambits no matter which spec you are as a warden, so even Redline Warden will have access to these defensive tools, but you can boost them a little bit in the blue line and they'll be more effective overall if you are a tanking warden. But moving down the list, I should actually cover Shield Mastery, but first I'll cover the one that's earlier in that gambit sequence, which is Shield Up. So Shield Up is going to be Shield, Spear, Fist, and this one, kind of similar to the Readied Blade gambit that we just checked out, it reduces incoming damage, but this time for tactical and range damage, and it also gives you a chunk of block rating. Again, this is a valuable gambit to keep up to boost your defenses. And before we get to shield tactics, I will say that shield mastery is not technically a new gambit, but you used to only get it in the blue line, and now you can have it as a red line warden as well, and it just gives you a pretty large boost to block rating. Again, a 1 minute duration. That is going to be shield, spear, fish, shield, just for reference. And then shield tactics is the other new one that's going to be 2-3-1-2, and this one gives you a critical defense buff for a minute, but the important effect from shield tactics that it did used to have in the blue line was that it gives you a stun immunity buff. Now, while the shield tactics gambit itself has a 0.8 second cooldown, which is normal for the gambits in the LOTRO with the Warden, there is going to be a hidden timer with shield tactics that you can only get the stun immunity benefit once every 20 seconds. So after you use the stun immunity benefit, a 20-second timer starts, and during that time you cannot get the stun immunity benefit again. And of course that means the main benefit of this ability is going to be the stun immunity effect, but it does give you some crit defense as well. So those are all of the new gambits, but all of the ones with the spear builder do have their own assailment version. But with the Warden Revamp, the way the assailment stance works and the assailment gambits is they actually have the same effects as the melee ones. So all the effects that we just went over, all of the range gambits have the same effect, but of course they will be from range. Now I will point out an ability like deflection. This one actually doesn't do damage in assailment, and it has a melee range. So I'm honestly not entirely sure if this is bugged or not fully implemented in the beta, but I did want to point that one out. Moving down the list though, we can see that Javelin of Fate has the same effect as the melee version. You will also maybe notice that the damage is a little bit off compared to the melee versions. Because this is early in beta and I am still testing everything out, I don't know if this is intended or if this is something they're planning on fixing to have the melee and range versions actually do the same damage, or if it will vary based on traits, which I actually do not have any now. I did not specialize for the purposes of this video. And I know Standing Stone Games did say that the assailment or javelin gambits are currently bugged right now with their damage anyway. This has really been a long-winded way to say we'll have to wait until the actual release of this update to see exactly how the melee and range versions of gambits compare, but I will say if you try to apply the damage over time effect from the melee one, and then you try to apply the ranged effect, they will not stack, and whichever one you use last will overwrite the previous effect on the enemy. And with those notes out of the way, let's go ahead and move down the list, and we have Range Cauterizing Steel, which is again like the melee version, but it is ranged and it still consumes power attack, mighty blow, and unerring strike effects. Further down the list we have Ranged Unseen Strike, which again is like the melee version, and it still has the AoE 6 meter radius effect. You can just use it at enemies 30 meters away from you, and once again it consumes your 3-2 gambit line. And next up, we do actually have these defensive boosts because they all have a spear, or if you're an assailment, they have a javelin builder, and they once again have the same effect, and you cannot stack them. So we have Readied Blade, Shield Mastery, Shield Tactics, and Shield Up as well. So now we have the new gambits and what their effects are. I think now is a good time to look at how the gambits we have already had in the game have changed. So as we take a look at some of these changed gambits, I will, for simplicity, only be showing the melee version because again, the range versions have the same effect. So we're going to start off with what I have called the utility gambit sequence because these don't really have too much of a common effect, but they do follow the same sequence. So starting off, Reversal still removes a corruption effect from the enemy, and then Android Maneuver, overall pretty similar effect, but now you gain a finesse rating buff in addition to the decreased attack duration. As a note, there is no yellow line trait to reduce fellowship inductions. And then if we move on to Warden's Triumph, again a similar effect, but it has the combined effect of the old melee and range version, and it has a new increase to Warden damage over time pulses, so your DOTs can last longer if you maintain Warden's Triumph. And honestly, just to get it out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Dark Before Dawn, which is pretty similar to before, but the way it restores power is slightly different. You don't have an initial boost to power, and now it's just over time power restore, which could definitely be important as power is seemingly becoming an important mechanic in the game again. Currently, I have 4 gambits showing on the screen, and we're going to be going over each gambit sequence that these gambits are a part of separately. So each gambit in a gambit sequence now has consistent effects. So for example, with Boar's Rush, the Spear Fist and the Spear Fist Spear gambit have the same special effects, so they do AoE damage. And there we go, I basically covered what the Spear Fist Gambit line does now. It's AoE damage, and it's all upfront and not over time. Wall of Steel, so that's going to be the Spear Shield Gambit sequence, that will just do upfront damage to a single target. Moving on, the Spear Virtue Gambit line has stayed pretty much the same, but it will tick slightly faster than it used to. So it used to do light damage every 4 seconds, and now it will do light damage every 3 seconds, so it goes a little bit faster. And finally, our beloved Bleed line does the same as it used to, except they will not be a part of a chain, because the way chains used to work, of course, is being changed, that you can use any 2-length gambit followed by any 3-length gambit followed by any 4 or 5-length gambit to get a gambit chain effect. But yes, the point is that the Spear Shield Fist gambit sequence will just bleed the enemy now. Moving on to some determination gambits, we will look at the Fist Shield line, which is a little bit more simplified in that each gambit in this sequence will not have an extra special effect, but now they just do AoE damage over time, which is of course the main effect that they used to have, but they don't have anything extra now. I also have the Morale Tap, AoE Morale Tap gambit line here, and that includes Resolution and Exaltation of Battle, as well as Fierce Resolve. Now, Fierce Resolve and Exaltation of Battle will do an AoE Morale Tap over time, while Resolution will do an upfront AoE Morale Tap for a little bit stronger effect, but again, no overtime effect. So that's pretty much what it used to do. Now, things do get slightly complicated with the shield gambits because some of them have unique effects within gambit sequences. So we'll start off with the healing gambit sequence, which is going to be Shield Spear. And please ignore the numbers on Persevere because this is bugged in the beta for how much it heals. But the additional effect this has besides a short duration heal is going to be increasing your incoming healing modifier. Safeguard will just have a basic heal, and Celebration of Skill will not have a heal over time, but rather a direct upfront heal that is supposed to be stronger than the other heals, but again, it seems like the numbers are bugged in this beta. And finally, Restoration is going to be the biggest overall heal, but it's going to be over time. The last main gambit sequence that we have to look at is going to be the Shield Fist or self-buff gambit line. Again, there are new gambits that self-buff, but hey, we already covered those. Anyway, with Impressive Flourish, that one's no longer going to do damage over time, but it does increase your parry rating. Maddening Strike increases your evade rating. Hey, Dance of War increases your evade rating, but it also gives you increased physical mitigation. And then Conviction gives you increased tactical mitigation along with evade rating. Conviction still has the Fellowship heal over time. And the final gambits we have to look at today are going to be the Potency gambits, or the ones that have two of the same gambit builder icons. So we have Death Strike, which can put you in Potency, Defensive Strike, which can put you in Potency, and Goad, which, guess what? Can put you in Potency. Goad is still going to be an AoE, but it no longer has a damage over time effect, and that's actually pretty similar with these other two, in that they do not have additional effects besides putting you in Potency. And for anybody unaware, Potency is what lets you use the battle memory mechanic on the Warden, so if you use a gambit while you have the Potency effect, that gambit will be stored in battle memory, and you will just be able to cast that whenever you want. And since we have covered all of the gambit lines and all of the new gambits, that is all I have for this video. It wasn't necessarily intended to be like a full comprehensive guide on the gambits and how they work now, but mainly showing the new gambits, their effects, and how they are built and fit in with the gambit system, as well as how all the old gambits changed in this revamp. There's honestly still a whole lot to cover with the Warden Revamp, so I will probably be breaking it down in videos like this as I, again, myself am still learning the new Warden. And if you learned something useful or enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing for more, and thanks for watching, everyone.